over the marriage bill, it bucks the trend, which is completely clear. Could you suggest some reasons why the politicians vote so strongly against it?
Well, personally, I think that the fundamental reason is a grassroots reaction to what was the Affordable Care Pathway and to the idea of assisted suicide. Over many years, at least 10, I've had to deal with relatives who have seen bad practice with respect to what I would call palliative care. And this occurs because of bad practice. The relatives often don't understand what's going on, they're tired, they're weary, they want to trust the doctors. They don't want to antagonise the doctors or raise complaints. But then they realise, partly through the media, partly because of things that are now in the public domain, like the issue of hydration and nutrition in the LCP, that there was something wrong. And a lot of, I say ordinary in no disrespectful sense, people realise that there's something fundamentally wrong when they're not spoken to, when treatment is withdrawn, when hydration is stopped, and they are simply left in a side room with a syringe driver. They sense that there's something wrong. And that has been going on for probably 10 and more years. So the palliative care, which has hitherto been the jewel in the crown of British medicine, with Kubler-Ross in the States and Cecily Saunders and Nigel Sykes and others in this country in the 70s and 80s. It was developed in this country. Walk down any high street and you will see shops for the local hospice. It is quite extraordinary. And 3/4 of hospice care is, rightly or wrongly, paid for out of charitable donations. So we have a very proud tradition of palliative care in this country. But all that seemed to change, and people realised that in some areas, in some hospitals, in some units, things were going wrong. And what was extraordinary was the way that the relatives, unlike in normal litigation and complaints, really wanted the doctors to do the right thing. They were behind the doctors. Not a lot of money in litigation if you're 80 years of age. But what struck me, and I hope what has struck you, is the nature of this grassroots. And you must listen, as I'm sure you have, to Bobby here. People fundamentally know what is right and wrong. They may not understand it at the material time. But over the years, they get to know, they get to understand. Those memories are still raw. They understand what should be done. They understand you shouldn't be withdrawing hydration and nutrition. They understand and come to a better understanding of what should have been done in their relative's case. So I think that was important. I think the landmark lecture, which I had the privilege of attending with my now daughter-in-law in June 2012 with Patrick Pollicino, who highlighted a lot of the issues over the LCP, was important. So was the Neuberger report in 2013, which itemised a lot of the problems with the LCP. And although that inquiry should not have lasted just 3 months, it should have been a lot longer than that. Nevertheless, there were a number of meetings where Neuberger and others were made aware of the concerns of relatives of those that have died. Behind all that as well, I think the Catholic Church, non-Christian churches, the Christian Medical Fellowship, other pro-life organisations have done a tremendous job in writing to their MPs about this issue, and that is extraordinarily important. When MPs get letters and testimonies, that makes a difference. And you have to bear in mind that when they had the Morris Bill on the 11th of September, Parliament had just come back. It was a Friday afternoon. It was a very warm Friday afternoon. You wouldn't expect MPs to be there. So I think it's been a grassroots issue. I think it's because people have realised what has gone wrong, but they intuitively know with time what is right, and have got behind the doctors and behind the nurses to try and get them to do the right things, because after all we're talking about one's nearest and dearest. And that's why you've got to listen to Bobby Schindler. This has been going on for years. He is doing in America, heroically, what others have been doing in this country. And that result in the Morris Bill was absolutely extraordinary in one sense. It's bucked the trend. And we must not say that it is inevitable, that it's going to roll out and that's what we're going to have. Because our British Parliament, the mother of Parliament, has said no. And has probably said no for years, if not generations. And that is the message that needs to go out. It is not inevitable. And we tend to think of things in a particular historic context. But as a doctor, as a member of the medical profession, I've got to remind you of the timeliness of medicine. Down the centuries, across the world, it is not simply a matter of a few political campaigns. These issues are far more fundamental than that. And we as doctors and nurses, healthcare professionals, carers, concerned relatives have got a job of work to do. What we now need to do is not be triumphalistic about this, but re-establish the fundamental principles of palliative care. I hope that goes somewhere towards you.
That's very good, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, any...
Mine's for Mr. Schreiber. I really enjoyed your talk, thank you. I was just wondering, you said a lot of the issues you face and the system faces generally is money motivated, is very money driven, and that makes total sense. But is the situation worse in countries without free healthcare? So is the situation worse in America, where the healthcare system is more money driven than say over here with the NHS? Do you face bigger issues over there than you would here?
Yeah, maybe Dr. or even Colin could answer that. I'm not real familiar with how healthcare works outside of the US too much. I mean, I hear NHS is problematic when it comes to this issue. But we work primarily in America, and I've seen already kind of the influence or the result of Obamacare, so to speak, and where it seems to me that hospitals are now empowered to make decisions where it was once the parents and the loved ones advocating for their loved ones. So we see the shift now where families that are asking for certain types of medical treatment, it's now become up to the hospital whether they receive it or not. And we're seeing more of that, more of those decisions being made by hospitals and doctors rather than parents, whoever it is that's advocating for the person in the hospital. And that's what frightens us, because when it does become the decision of the doctors and hospitals, and again, I speak with a broad brush, but what's motivating the hospital to make that decision? Is it really the best interest of the patient, or are they worried about the cost of perhaps the care that person's going to need? That might be a drain on that hospital, and they see a solution rather as terminating whatever it is terminating treatment rather than continued care. And this would give you something I didn't have a chance to talk about today, just real quick. The one thing that we're seeing an increase of is this maybe doctor can speak to this too, but this whole brain death stuff. I don't know if you're real familiar with it here in the UK, but in America, there seems to be even more and more this quick diagnosis. Say for example, someone experiences a car accident, they experience a catastrophic brain injury. What we're seeing with the calls that we get is that hospitals, doctors, are in a very short period of time, I'm speaking hours from when the person gets into the hospital, is admitted to the hospital, these doctors are diagnosing this person as being brain dead. And the reason that seems to be motivating these quick diagnoses of brain death is because they want to get at the person's organs. The organ donation business, I read in the Discovery magazine a wonderful article about this whole brain death controversy. It came out a few years ago. It's a $20 billion a year industry, not million, billion. The whole organ donation. When you combine that type of money with this whole brain death, they had to create a way, just like they created a way to remove the hurdle, remove feeding tubes. They also had to do the same thing with this whole brain death diagnosis, and it's been, and I don't know the exact details, but the whole brain death diagnosis has been changed to make it easier now to diagnose someone as being brain dead in order to have the opportunity to get to the person's organs. So when you have so let me say this. So when you have those types of situations, there's a huge demand for organs in the United States. So you can see again this conflict of interest of when you look at it this way. So say someone comes into the hospital, and the hospital looked at this person saying, okay, they sit back, they see he's got a, there's obviously there's some type of catastrophic brain injury. But when you see when the hospital is faced with, okay, do we spend our resources for the next month, 6 weeks, 8 weeks to see if this person can improve, rather than saying he's brain dead and then get money for the whole organ donation progress? What do you think the hospital's going to want to do? Rather than drain their resources from keeping this person alive and see if they can be helped, as compared to the money that they perhaps are going to save or even make off of someone being diagnosed as brain dead, you can see there's a huge conflict of interest there. And what's even more people don't realize is organ donations. The person has to be alive. What kills them is when they extract the organs. So you cannot kill, and again, maybe doctor can, if he needs to clarify this or not, but my understanding from speaking to doctors is that in order to get a person's organs, they must be alive. And the actual procurement of the organs is what kills that person. So they can't die and then you go in and get the organs. I think there's some organs you can't, I think the eye and some other parts, the person can be dead, like the cornea, whatever. But I'm talking about the major organs. That person must be alive. So we're seeing a real increase, and I know I'm kind of answering the wrong answer to your question, but we're seeing a real increase in the quickness of this whole brain. It's become very controversial in America, this whole brain death. We were involved in the Jahai McMath case. I don't know if you remember that, the girl in California that was diagnosed as being brain dead. The parents fought it, erupted this huge publicity, this huge battle, trying to keep this young girl alive. So nonetheless, we're seeing more and more people being diagnosed in a very quick period of time of being brain dead. And it seems to me it's done in order to get at these people's organs. So I don't know if there's any.
So how is it legal for a hospital to harvest a person's organs? I mean, they have to get the family members' consent, isn't it?
My understanding is, yes, that they must get, but when you have a hospital and the doctors doing everything that they can to convince the family that this is the right thing to do, and telling the family that your loved one has no chance of recovery, there's nothing we can do to help him, but he could give life to somebody else. Families today, more than anything, need advocates, because they simply do not understand or know their rights when it comes to when it comes to defending their loved ones when they're in the hospital. And the power that, if I use the word power, the power that they have before the hospital or doctors can do anything. But many times they're being pressured and bullied into making decisions that they necessarily don't want to make. So.
It is a very wide topic of brain death. I should just say there's a very interesting philosophical paper on brain death by somebody called Joseph Seifert. That's Seifert. He's an Austrian. That examines the philosophical question: is brain death actual death? He concludes, I think quite convincingly, that there is only actual death, and you can't equate so-called brain death with actual death. That's one of your points. You next.
I wondered if I could ask about kind of advanced dementia care and feeding in dementia. Like, I know in a lot of hospital boards they would give, I think, peg feeds to people with dementia, but wherever they say that isn't, like, they don't need it, but in fact at the end of dementia their kind of need for hunger diminishes. I don't know if people could say is that maybe not true, or, you know, like, first of all, maybe spoon feeding, but people are refusing. Like, is there a problem with peg feeding, or?
Actually, can you just repeat the question for the people that didn't hear that?
Oh, sorry. Could you...
Sorry, it's just about feeding in dementia care. Whether, like, I guess we would be taught that it doesn't, that giving tube feeds to end-stage dementia kind of is
Tube
pointless,
feeding doesn't
or
benefit the dementia
Yeah.
patient. So is tube feeding
that they don't feel
beneficial
hungry
in
and
the sense
things.
that at the last stages of dementia? Is
Yeah.
that the...
Basically, we make the practical distinction between those who can't swallow, and those that don't swallow or won't swallow. And if somebody has vascular dementia as a result of strokes, it may be that they cannot swallow, and therefore they should have assisted feeding, including peg feeding where appropriate. About 50–55% of people who have strokes are unable to swallow safely in the immediate post-stroke period. And that figure goes down to about 5% at 6 months. And most of the recovery is in the first month or so. So I've always taken the view, as a gastroenterologist who fits these pegs, that if the patient can't swallow, even if they have dementia, they should have assisted feeding. The actual number of patients in my hospital, and I'm thinking now over 20 years, is actually very, very small that have dementia. The other issue is if you can't swallow. You can't swallow because you're dying of cancer, you can't swallow because you've got behavioural problems, profound learning disability, or even dementia. But you can swallow, it's just that you don't.
Yeah.
Now, those patients who have safe swallows should be encouraged and nursed and helped and fed. Now, the confusion has arisen because of the word dementia. And sadly, if you look at so many cases that die, dementia only seems to have one category, severe. That's not true. So it's a very dangerous label to have if you go to hospital, particularly if you're not known. Because if you're labelled as dementia, given a little bit of sedation, then you become mentally incapacitated. And as Bobby's pointed out, that often means that your decision-making, is taken over by the doctors under the Mental Capacity Act 2005, unless you have an attorney, and not many people do, either here or in Scotland. So it's very dangerous. It sets the switch. And then we have the mythology about feeding doesn't help people with dementia.
That's why I was wondering.
Now, I find that very difficult from a physiological point of view. What is it about the systemic physiology of somebody who's got dementia that means that they don't obey the normal physiological rules of metabolism? I just don't understand that. And in our own series, over a number of years, there is an advantage in giving egg feeding. There is a mortality in the first year or so, and then in our hands it tended to sort of level out at about 50% and then go up slightly after about 3 or 4 years. So peg feeding used appropriately does seem to prolong life, at least in our hands, in our particular studies. But there is this mythology that has arisen that peg feeding somehow doesn't help patients with dementia who cannot swallow, which is something that I don't understand. But the majority of people with vascular dementia, even if they have problems swallowing, it usually resolves with time in the majority of cases. So the actual number of patients that need peg feeding is small. And I don't think that putting in a peg should be a substitute for good nursing care.
Sorry. My grandmother died of dementia last Friday, and she was like really, really late stages. And they said that they tried tube feeding her because she was unresponsive, she didn't swallow, she couldn't chew that all. They tried tube feeding her, but it didn't work because her brain had shut down, so that it wouldn't like process the food. So is that like?
Doesn't make any sense at all.
Doesn't make any sense. Okay.
No, the gut physiology will be independent of cerebral function.
Oh.
You know, if you've got somebody who has a major head injury, for example, or somebody's on ITU, on a ventilator, and you artificially feed them, it still works. I just don't understand that concept at all.
Unless she was saying something else.
No, it was dementia. She was shutting down and she said that she didn't take food because her brain wasn't functioning enough to function on organs down there. So she basically said.
I just wonder if, as with Bobby and Colin, people are redefined according to cerebral functions, and then you get these absurd medical things that relate to a different kind of being.
Yeah, listening to the talks today and the questions you're giving even, it seems that more and more of the decisions to do life are to do with doctors and healthcare professionals. What needs to be changed within their education in order to change their mindsets?
Colin, would you like to?
I think the most important thing is to recognise the value, the status, the dignity of the person. In her last years, Ali was concerned about being in hospital. We were fortunate our local GP practice was absolutely first class. The doctors knew her well, respected her well, gave first class treatment. But she was always concerned about going into a hospital where there would be different doctors and different nurses, and even when she was in the times during the last few years, there were some things that happened that really shouldn't have happened. And I think it is the lack of certainty about whether the doctor truly has your best interests at heart. And I think re-establishing that doctors are fallible, they do make mistakes, but if they're honest mistakes, you can accept that. I think the concern is that sometimes vulnerable people more and more perhaps think they don't know if they can trust the doctors. And in fact, in the last few weeks, in fact, Ali died of malnutrition. Interestingly, it was on her death certificate. The doctor didn't want to put malnutrition on the death certificate because he said there was a problem with somebody in England died of malnutrition. How on earth can you die of malnutrition? And in fact, on the death certificate, it does have malnutrition related to her spina bifida. and perhaps, you could argue that because of basic physiology and problems resulting from the condition of spinal lift, she did have eating difficulties, which she'd had for several years, so it could be related. But although I certainly trusted the GPs and trusted who they were recommending to refer to her in local hospitals, when it came to an awareness that Ali was in serious difficulty because of the malnutrition, and there was question, that in fact there had been a question, in fact, for quite a while, whether she should have peg feeding or some other tube feeding. The person I contacted was Philip, and because I trust him. And his knowledge, although it's obviously expert knowledge, his knowledge would be known certainly by doctors in local hospitals, but I trust him. And I think that's a big issue nowadays. Do people trust doctors? And with things like the Liverpool Care Pathway, and the way that was handled, and the way that people felt their loved ones were not being properly treated at the end of life, I think there is an issue of trust. And I think that has to be re-established more than anything.
How would that happen though? Does that not mean we need to focus in on that area going forward? If that seems to be the crux of the problem, and not trusting doctors, even if we don't have the answers, what do we need to focus on that?
Well, there is a difficulty because some doctors you can't trust. I mean, that is a fundamental problem. There are doctors, there are nurses, there are other healthcare professionals who would say that somebody, because they are old, or they're disabled, or they have certain conditions, actually their lives are not worth living. Now, if we had voluntary euthanasia or assisted suicide, and you know that healthcare professionals are being involved in actually ending the lives of people, the element of trust is, the element of lack of trust is going to be heightened. So, I think if already we are having questions about trusting doctors, I think we do have to address it, and in a way it can only be done by, I guess, within medical colleges establishing, what is a proper medical code of ethics, and getting, I think, back to the Hippocratic Oath. But I think that trust will be eroded if we go further down the road of removing protection for vulnerable people.
Okay, thank you. Question over here.
Thank you. Thank you all for taking the time to talk to us at the weekend. Do you think this is something that's being thrusted upon the medical industry? How do doctors and nurses feel about murdering people? Are they willing in doing this? Are they numb to it? Are they apathetic to it? Or what is the feeling on the ground?
I think the vast majority of doctors and nurses do not want to directly and deliberately kill their patients. Perhaps there are a few, even in this country, that would. And I think the experience from Germany in the Nazi era and contemporaneously is that it probably becomes easier after you've done it just a few times. And Dr. Mark von Hoey has done it several hundred times, according to his own admission. So there may be some doctors who take that view. And if you look at that particular documentary, which is freely available, I think you might agree with me that the thing that comes across more than anything else is the banality of it all. It became routine. He didn't really counsel that lady, didn't really treat her. As a GP, he didn't think he needed a psychiatric opinion. He was dealing with a grief reaction, well within the time frame that most of us might regard as unexceptional. And then you see him simply filling out the forms afterwards, natural death. It's the banality of it all. I think it's important that, in relation to what's been said before, is that patients trust their doctors. They always used to. And one of the things about palliative care, if you go back 20, 30 years ago, is that not only was it the jewel in the crown of British medicine, but the palliative care doctors were the ones that were almost the conscience of the medical profession. Always thinking about how they communicated, how they individualised care. Could they have done things better? How did they react to the relatives in difficult situations and so on? You could see them agonising over these issues, and that's very important. And that gives, as has just been said, confidence. Doctors get it wrong, nurses get it wrong, but they must be able to adapt, reflect on what they're doing. And that is something that was lost with the Liverpool care pathway. Palliative care became patient in the side room, with or without relatives, no hydration, a syringe driver, and death with a median time of 36 hours. I was told by junior doctors new to the firm that, Dr. Harte, you needn't see these patients, these two patients. They're on the Liverpool care pathway. Quite the opposite. So I think it's important, this concept of trust. It's a little bit like climate change. Up goes the temperature just a little bit, and the moral environment changes quite substantially. So when you get a shift in opinion within society, which obviously is reflected as well in the medical profession, towards the fundamental value of every human life, it becomes dangerous. And once you lose that, then you lose a lot of the very raison d'etre of medicine. And one of the things which struck me many years ago in reading the Hippocratic Corpus was an odd statement, you might think, that in times of plague, there were doctors who did not desert the city. Whatever else you can say about the Greek physician, he was a good diagnostician. He knew when people were likely to die. He could describe fevers and dengue and yellow fever and malaria. By staying in the city, he would know that his life would be at risk. Now, throughout the history of medicine, there have always been doctors who have a fundamental understanding of the dignity of human beings through their sufferings. And when you are faced with severe illness, when you are faced with terminal illness, there you see, in many cases, the growth and development and understanding of the individual. If you want to measure whatever your philosophy in life is, if you want to throw a spotlight on it, look at it in the light of your mortality. There's nothing for most of us that brings a sense of a mortality, the meaning, the purpose, the significance of life than our own mortality. Serious illness, life-threatening illness, terminal illness. And throughout the centuries, doctors and nurses have recognized the dignity of humans, fellow humans, precisely, one might say uniquely, in their struggle against disease, in the face of serious illness, life-threatening illness, terminal illness. That's always been the case. It always will be the case. I would recommend you read Viktor Frankl, Search for Meaning. He was a psychiatrist. He was in Auschwitz. he had the opportunity of escaping Auschwitz. And if you read his book, he describes his last wardrobe. Not that he could do very much for those in Auschwitz, but he described his last wardrobe, knowing that he had been selected to escape. And he did that wardrobe with a heavy heart. Then went outside and spoke to the other members of the team, the escape team. Then he went back to his patients and he stayed. Because he realized the dignity of his patients. I heard something on the radio a few months ago. I can't remember where it was, it might have been Syria. And a woman doctor was asked about her concerns about working in that hospital with all the bombing and the shelling and the risks to her. And she simply answered, "I am a doctor. Where should I be?" There are times throughout the history of medicine where doctors and nurses have had to put their lives on the line. In all sorts of ways. Times of war, times of disaster, times even within living memory, when doctors and nurses could risk contracting TB, infectious diseases from which they could die. That is still the case if we were to have a bioterrorist catastrophe in London, for example. Question: what would the doctors do? What would the medical students do? There would still be doctors, mindful of the dignity from their experience and from the cumulative experience of medicine, that looks to see the dignity of the individual, the dignity of the human person, precisely in and because of their illness. And for many of us, perhaps most of us, we only see the individual as an individual when they are, so to speak, up against it. And that defines your philosophy. That defines the meaning, the purpose, the significance of your life in a way that nothing else can. And for the majority of us, that is what helps to define us, and that is what doctors see, that is what nurses see, uniquely through suffering. So it is that respect for the individual that is so important, and that's always been there, down the centuries, across the world, in all sorts of circumstances, and it will always be there.
Thank you very much. I think that sums up a lot of what we've heard from the three of you today. We've just got time about suffering. We've just got time for two quick questions. Gentleman there.
It's just a broad question for everyone. My impression is that we repealed euthanasia and assisted suicide in the UK, but hearing how we're talking about it today, it exists already. Would it be fair to say that, in fact, it does exist already? And how should we talk about it? How should we talk about this law if, in fact, what is the nature of the scale? Who is informed about this? Who is regulating this? Is anyone regulating this? What is the point of this law if it does in fact already exist?
Okay, we'll go to Colin on this.
Well, if you spoke to somebody like David Cameron, he would say the law does not allow euthanasia in this country and he would be opposed to it. And I think most people have the view that there is no law allowing euthanasia. Strictly speaking, there are two main issues you have to distinguish. Euthanasia, which is where the doctor kills the patient, and so-called assisted suicide, often called assisted dying, where the lethal drugs are prescribed and the patient ends his own life, although as Philip mentioned in his talk, in jurisdictions where that has been introduced, the doctor typically has to be on standby in case it doesn't work, because it doesn't always work, and then he has to finish them off. So whether you can really get, well, you possibly can get assisted suicide without euthanasia, but often the two go hand in hand. There's this problem with the definition of what euthanasia is, yeah, and also whether it's voluntary or involuntary. I use the definition of euthanasia as an act or an omission, which by intention is aimed at ending the life of the patient, typically a suffering patient. Now, to my mind, Tony Bland was killed in this country, and it was an act of non-voluntary euthanasia. His life was deliberately ended, he wasn't dying, but there was no lethal injection. And I think there has been perhaps a little too much silence on the part of those opposed to euthanasia about the ongoing practice of ending the lives of people in the same similar conditions as Tony Bland. Exactly how Terry died, removal of food and fluids.
In the UK, you would say this is euthanasia happening today, even though the law...
The official version is we do not have euthanasia, but to my mind, if you are ending the lives of people who are not otherwise dying, Tony Bland could have lived for another 30 years if his food and fluids had not been removed.
How many people do you think are losing their life in this way?
Hard to know exactly. Before 2005, when the Mental Capacity Act came in, cases had to go to the courts for permission to end the lives, and there were a number of conditions, and it was clear that as time went on from Tony Bland's death in 1993, that the so-called strict criteria of ending the lives was being diminished. So for people who are not clearly in what they call persistent vegetative state, but who are close to being in that state, their lives were ended. With the Mental Capacity Act, people can have advance directives, or they can have attorneys, and it doesn't need to go to courts for decisions as it did before that. So I'm not sure if you have figures on how widely that may be taking place. In a sense, it's almost what happened with the Liverpool Care Pathway. If you sedate people so they're not eating, they will die, and if it happens in a quiet sideboard of the hospital, who knows what is happening. So I think this is an important concern. I think it has to be addressed.
It's happening even though
I think it will vary in the hospitals. I very much suspect that under Philip's watch it isn't happening. But in other hospitals, it does appear to be happening.
Okay, we have the last question, this gentleman here.
Right, okay, thanks. This is for Dr. Philip. Yeah, when I started working in medicine, it was around about the time the Liverpool Care Pathway was getting ripped up. And yeah, the time I spent working with palliative care patients at that time was really, really rewarding. What I want to know from you is there anything that's replaced the Liverpool Care Pathway? Is there like a statutory way to deal with terminal illnesses now, or is it left up to individual cases to be decided?
That's a difficult one to answer, because there is still the area of the Liverpool Care Pathway, and I certainly don't know what's happening in every hospital. Certainly the effect of the Neuberger report in 2013 was extraordinary, because prior to that, if you'd asked medical students about palliative care, it began and ended with the Liverpool Care Pathway. I suspect now a lot of medical students, junior doctors, don't even know what the Liverpool Care Pathway is. Certainly the Neuberger report flagged up a lot of problems with palliative care. The paradox is we didn't need the Liverpool Care Pathway, because as I've said several times, we had good palliative care. So the issue now is to get back to good palliative care. And there are a number of criticisms which I won't rehearse about the Liverpool care pathway in relation to prognosis and so on. But one of the problems has been the lack of good evidence for the drugs that are used for secretions, nausea, vomiting, agitation and so on. And unfortunately, over the last 10 to 15 years, in my view, we have lost a lot of opportunity for genuine research. We have ignored a lot of well-proven palliative procedures. As a gastroenterologist, for example, we have esophageal stents, colonic stents, biliary stents, and so on. These are palliative procedures, which didn't really get a mention with the LCP. So the essential answer to your question is we've got to re-establish the fundamental principles and practice and research of good palliative care. I have a problem with this term, which I rarely use, end-of-life care, for the last few days or hours of life. Now, why on earth, if you're the doctor that's been looking after a patient, should you be only considering palliative care in the last few days or hours of life? Where have you been in relation to the diagnostic pathway? Did you ever talk to them about the scans and the biopsies and the treatment options? It's almost as if these things never happen. We should be following our patients over a period of time with our palliative care colleagues to establish what is the right thing to do and how to treat patients with respect to good palliative care, in my view. I just want to answer your question as well, on a technical level. You can't answer it because of the threshold effect. One cannot say so many people are dying as a result of current practice unless it's proven.
We don't want to have a sort of an ideology which is unsupportable. But I was just interested in your combined opinion. Is this something that's actually happening now?
I think it may very well be happening now, but less than it was. And in many hospitals, much less than it was.
Okay, we're going to have to sort of wrap up. Just a final few words for Bobby, and then afterwards there's a Kaylee and Bobby.
I just want to thank you again for inviting me to be here. I really appreciate you taking the time to be here this weekend for the conference. I forgot to mention our website is lifeandhope.com. It's in the PowerPoint. We can also go to Facebook and put in Terry Scheibe Life and Hope Network. We'd love for you to like our page. We update it pretty much every day, if not more than once a day, with cases, with resources, and we can learn more and stay on top of this issue and at the same time support the work we're doing. So I urge you to do that. Thank you again.
Yeah, can I just say one thing? And it's partly answering the question I think Dan asked, or leading on from that. Parliament decides on these questions, I think, in two ways. Partly it will look at the facts, but a lot of MPs don't exactly look at the facts, they look at where public opinion is. And public opinion is shaped largely in the media, which doesn't really get to grips with all the facts or the details. They look at personal stories. Now, I think the reason why Bobby is able to speak so convincingly, so compellingly on this, because he has the personal story. I've been involved with Alison. Philip's been involved with his patients. You have personal stories. In many ways, that's what influences people more than the hard facts. And I'm sure that each of you, in your lives, one way or another, have a story. You have a grand or a grandfather, a mother or father, aunt or uncle, a friend. Or you've met us, or you know somebody else. Use the stories, keep it human, because that is ultimately what we are trying to promote. It's the humanity, it's the love, it's the care, it's the compassion. And the other side has been able to manipulate the media because it's used stories. It's used stories, somebody going over to Zurich, going over to Dignitas, somebody going to the High Court, and it's always like a pretty high-powered, intensive story of somebody in a personal situation. There are people in your lives that you know, or you will be aware of people through us. Make it human, make it personal, make it count.
Well, thank you very much.